Breaking news, the United States Supreme Court will let Virginia move ahead with its purge of voters only 6 days before the election. Welcome back to Democracy Docket. I'm Marc Elias.
And I'm Paige Moskowitz. Let's get started. This morning, the U.S. Supreme Court said that Virginia can reinstate its voter purge program, even though lower courts had ruled that it likely violates the National Voter Registration Act. Marc, give us background on the case and what the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling means for voters.
Okay, so the first thing I want people to do is to take a deep breath here, okay? This is not going to affect the outcome of the election. Virginia is not a particularly swingy state. We're talking about a very, very small number of voters at stake here. That is not to say it is not a serious legal issue. It is. And it's not to say that we shouldn't care that even a small number of voters may be disenfranchised. We should. What's going on in Virginia is that the governor, Glenn Youngkin, who sort of ran as a moderate Republican, thinking that the days of Donald Trump might be behind the Republican Party, now is trying to play catch up and prove just how MAGA he is. So on August 7th, Governor Youngkin issued an executive order ordering the purging of voters who did not respond to a citizenship verification request. Now, this gets very, very complicated in how this is done, but suffice to say that the state of Virginia came to the conclusion that there were 1,600 voters who might be non-citizens. There's a dispute about facts here about whether they self-identified as non-citizens or not, but the state of Virginia essentially went out and picked this fight because Governor Youngkin wanted to pick a fight over this while this issue of non-citizenship voting was becoming the next big thing for the MAGA movement. Civil rights groups and the Department of Justice sued to block the program, correctly pointing out that the National Voter Registration Act has a 90-day quiet period, which means during that time period, 90 days before the election, states can't engage in systematic removal of voters. The federal district court that heard this case blocked the program and ordered the state to restore the registrations. The state then brought this case on an emergency basis to the shadow docket of the U.S. Supreme Court. And in an apparent 6-3, ruling without really any explanation, but with 3 noted dissents from the liberals, reinstated this, at least on a temporary basis, while the case moves up for potential consideration by the Supreme Court on the merits. This is a wrong-headed decision. It is a decision that the Supreme Court, frankly, sort of walked into a trap laid by the MAGA movement, laid by a governor trying to prove that he is worthy of Donald Trump's love. And what it has done is it has now given everyone who is rightly concerned and critical of the Supreme Court's intentions around Donald Trump in this elections a lot of anxiety and fuel to the fire. Why? Because number one, the Supreme Court typically says that courts shouldn't act in close proximity to election. And here we are 6 days before an election, and they've acted. Number one. Number two, they have seemingly disregarded a federal law that is very clear on its face and put it on hold. So this is an unfortunate, unforced error by the Supreme Court, or a forced error, if depending on your perspective. It's not going to affect the outcome of the election. But Paige, I got to tell you, my phone lit up with a lot of concerned people about what does this mean if and when there are really consequential cases that come before the Supreme Court.
Right, Marc, this federal law is very clear. It's probably one of the clearest federal laws when you think about it, because all it says is that states can't do big voter purges, big list maintenance within 90 days of a federal election. It was open and shut for the district court, for the Fourth Circuit to say, yeah, Virginia shouldn't be doing this. But this U.S. Supreme Court, as you noted, with no explanation, they didn't have to provide an opinion or a reason for why they ruled this way, reversed the lower court's decision and is letting Virginia go ahead with it. And that is really concerning because the law is clear and SCOTUS seems to be ignoring it. And we don't know why they're doing that. And we're left to fill in the blanks. And the blanks that are being filled in is that you have 6 justices who are either beholden to the Republican Party or aren't actually that interested in upholding the rule of law.
Yeah. And look, this is on top of Obviously, the immunity decision that the Supreme Court took heat over for frankly giving Donald Trump almost more protection than he asked for, on top of their decision to reverse the Colorado ruling that would have kept him off the ballot there. There are a lot of good reasons why people are concerned about the Supreme Court. And you might think that the Supreme Court, on a case that comes up on an emergency basis on the shadow docket, that doesn't have really high stakes, right? Let's be honest, this doesn't involve that many ballots, and it wasn't going to affect the outcome of the election. So this is one where you just scratch your head and you say, if you're the U.S. Supreme Court, why don't you just take a pass on this? Like, why don't you just be like, there's nothing that is driving us to jump into the middle of what is clearly a political dispute where Donald Trump is trying to elevate this issue of non-citizen voting. But, Paige, at some point you just have to think, well, maybe it's because the Supreme Court wants to be drawn into it. Maybe they actually do want to be involved in this. And that's a very different profile than we saw the Supreme Court in 2020, where, it really did stay out of most of the cases in the pre-election, and it stayed out of all of the cases in the post-election. So, my advice to people is, if you are worried about this, or if you just want to be an informed citizen on this, Democracy Docket right now is running a very limited time sale on its membership program. So if you click on the link above or in the show notes below, you can become a member of Democracy Docket for $20 off the usual price. But Paige, this is not the only case that raised this issue. There was also another case with another victory out of Alabama.
Right. And we'll get into Alabama more later because it is a very interesting situation happening there, especially in relation to this Virginia case. But I want to focus on the governor's actions because the governor chose to issue this executive order in August. He chose to order the removal very close to a federal election. What's his motivation for doing this in August of an election year versus even June or July, where you are very firmly outside of that 90-day window?
Look, I think that as I said, for the early part of Glenn Youngkin's career, he tried to portray himself as a moderate in Virginia politics. When Donald Trump became the nominee, he slowly but surely wanted to be seen as more MAGA friendly. I think once we hit this summer, he decided that his only future, because the governorship of Virginia is unusual in this country in that it is term limited to one term only. So Glenn Youngkin will have one term as governor and then he's out. And there really isn't any place for him to go. There's no chance that a Republican at this point could be elected to the United States Senate. He wouldn't want to run for a House seat. So there's really no place for him to go other than potentially into a Trump administration. And so I think that what happened in August is he decided that there was an opening for him to insert himself into the MAGA movement's attack on the fake issue, the made up concern about non-citizen voting. And this was his way to do it. And, that is a terrible reason for the governor of a state to do these kinds of things. But it more or less defines and illustrates the level of cowardice we see from Republican elected officials all throughout the country at all different levels.
Every time we talk about non-citizen voting and voter purges, the commentary we see online is non-citizens aren't allowed to vote anyway. It's against federal law. So why are we upset or frustrated when states take actions like this? Those voters shouldn't be on the rolls anyway. Why sue Virginia about removing voters under the claim that they have not verified their citizenship?
Yes, I'm really glad you asked that question because, the whole point of the quiet period is that states make mistakes, right? Like if states were only ever purging people from the rolls that should be removed from the rolls, you would never need any quiet period. The whole point of the quiet period is that there's an acknowledgement that states are necessarily going to make errors in not removing some people that they should, but also in removing some people that they shouldn't. So one of the ways we deal with that is we don't let them do these removals very close to elections, because if you remove someone erroneously very close to an election, you are functionally disenfranchising them, or at least very likely going to have an impact on their ability to vote and have their vote counted. And so it is not the case that what's going on here is that the state of Virginia is 100% certain that it is removing unlawful voters, and that the folks on the other side are 100% certain that the voters being removed are unlawful. There is a factual dispute about whether or not all of these people, some of these people, most of these people, what percentage of these people are in fact not eligible to vote, and which ones may in fact be eligible to vote or are eligible to vote. So it defeats the point of a quiet period if you start to say, well, we're just going to assume the state is correct, because the state is always saying it's removing people who should be removed. And we just know that that is not correct and accurate. Even when states act in good faith, that isn't correct and accurate. The final thing I'll say is that this law, the National Voter Registration Act, was a bipartisan bill that weighed all of these considerations. I mean, Congress made a determination on a bipartisan basis about how to balance the removal of people and the importance of taking people off the rolls who are either deceased or otherwise not eligible to vote, with the interest of making sure that lawful people are not removed from the rolls. And this was a legislative compromise that Congress passed, and one that has served our country really without controversy for 40 plus years. And so it is quite extraordinary that here we are 6 days before an election, and all of a sudden the US Supreme Court, in a case that seems highly dubious from the state of Virginia, is now, casting doubt on this, because it is not the job of the courts to legislate. It is not the job of the courts to second guess whether Congress got this right or not. This was a congressional decision well within their constitutional authority to regulate the time, place, and manner of federal elections. And so I suspect, Paige, that at the end of the day, the Supreme Court isn't going to take this case. The Supreme Court will lift the stay. The lower court ruling will stand, but it will be too late for 2024. And that is a very cynical take, but I hope people bookmark it, because I think that's what's going to happen.
And we know that states are making errors. We have seen reports that in Virginia, among these 1,600 purged voters, included both naturalized citizens and native-born citizens. Going back to Alabama, the state there had removed over 3,200 voters that they claimed were non-citizens. And it then turned out that over 60% of those voters were citizens who were eligible to vote. Now in Alabama, the court ordered the state to restore those registrations and to let those voters know that they are eligible to cast a ballot this fall. But in Virginia, if the voter purge is going back into effect, what happens to the voters there? Are they out of luck? Are they able to vote this fall at all? What should they do?
Look, if you show up at a polling location and you are not on the voter rolls for any reason, whether you've been purged or there's just some error, you are entitled to vote a provisional ballot. That is another provision of federal law. In a federal election, you're entitled to vote a provisional ballot. So no one who is not on the voter rolls, again, whether in Virginia or elsewhere as a result of a purge or otherwise, should ever walk out without voting a ballot, at least a provisional ballot. Now, provisional ballots are subject to greater scrutiny. They're subject to greater challenge. There may be follow-up that the voter has to do in order to prove that their ballot should count. And that's the unfortunate part of this, right? Because people shouldn't have to go through that rigmarole, and provisional ballots are oftentimes rejected as a result. But that's the fail-safe remedy here. The other thing that I'd urge people to do, again, not necessarily just in Virginia, but around the country, if you are concerned, or even if you're not concerned, you have some free time, check with your local county or state election office and see if you're registered. Like, you can check in many states, you can do this online. You can check the status of your voter registration. So check your voter registration, make sure that you have not been removed from the rolls, make sure that you are registered. And if you're in a state that allows same-day registration or registration close to election day and you're not on the rolls, register. And I happen to know, because I'm a resident of the Commonwealth of Virginia, Virginia does have same-day voter registration. So specifically in Virginia, that's the option that you can do. Again, assuming you don't want to call the county that you live in advance and check your voter registration. But we don't talk about this case because it's going to impact the outcome of the election. It's not going to, as I've said before. We talk about this because it is important for people who are watching this video and for all Americans to understand what the MAGA movement is about, what they are up to, because they use a lot of fine sounding phrases like election integrity, and they say that they're against non-citizen voting. What they're really in favor of is these last minute voter purges. And they're not doing this because they are trying to make the system better. If that was the case, you would not have seen Republican states leave the ERIC system, which is an interstate compact that we've talked about in previous videos and which Democracy Docket has covered extensively. They are doing these things because they want to create an air of irregularity. They want to lay the groundwork for Donald Trump to contest the outcome of the elections. And this is the reason why in 2020, I founded Democracy Docket, because I wanted there to be a place for voters to go to, for ordinary Americans and people who had questions about what is happening to democracy in court. What are the motivations of the Republicans in doing what they're doing? I wanted there to be a place for them to get accurate, timely information, analysis, and access to court pleadings. And so that's what Democracy Docket is. It is a resource for you to stay up to date on the latest voting rights and election news. If you sign up, you get free daily and weekly newsletters that keeps you up to date on all of that. And for a very limited time, Democracy Docket is offering a sale, $20 off the usual yearly subscription price for its premium membership program. The links for both the free subscription and the paid membership are up in the show notes below.
So there are 6 days until Election Day, and the U.S. Supreme Court has gotten itself involved in election litigation. Are there any other cases we're waiting for a SCOTUS decision on before Tuesday?
Yeah, so look, there's a big one. Probably more important than the Virginia one is a case out of Pennsylvania. This is a case that you and I have talked about in one form or another. I can't even count how many times, but this deals with the question of what happens when someone in Pennsylvania who votes by mail makes some kind of technical error with their mail-in ballot. The facts of that particular case had to do with voters who did not put their mail-in ballot inside the secrecy envelope and then put it in the outer envelope. So this was a so-called naked ballot, but this would also apply to people, for example, who misdate their ballots. Another topic you and I have discussed. And what the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said is that in those circumstances, if the voter determines that they made this error, like, after they vote the ballot, they're like, hey, I've got this extra secrecy envelope. Oh, I know what this is. I saw the Democracy Docket video. This is a naked ballot and my ballot won't count. If the voter figures that out and they go on election day and vote in person, they get to vote a provisional ballot and that ballot will count. So essentially, it's a way that the voter can fix the problem that they had by voting a provisional ballot and having their ballot count. That's what the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said. The Republican National Committee has now brought that to the U.S. Supreme Court, saying that that interpretation of state law violates the federal Constitution. This is a borderline frivolous claim on the part of the Republican Party. It is reviving what would be a very extreme version of the discredited and so far rejected independent state legislature theory, also something, Paige, you and I have talked a lot about, and which Democracy Docket has lots of content on their website. But we are expecting a decision in that case from the Supreme Court really any time over the next few days. So now is the perfect time for everyone to make sure you are subscribed to Democracy Docket's free daily and weekly newsletters. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Democracy Docket. We'll see you next time.